Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video I'd like to talk about Doctor Who once again, touching upon that great topic of great companions that never were in the history of Doctor Who. These are background characters that for one reason or another always stood out to me and left a lasting impression and made me always think they would have been a really fun time on further adventures in time and space in the TARDIS with the Doctor. And in this particular case I want to talk about Cyril and Lily Arwell from The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe, the Christmas special episode, as well as branching out to that common theme of children along on adventures in time and space, going all the way back to the first Doctor comic serials with John and Gillian. And I'm just fascinated by that aspect of it. And it's something, you know, the motivation behind it would be to try to recapture a feeling, a sensation that was really, you know, burgeoned in me as I was a youth in the 80s. And you had movies, these fantasy sort of horror genre movies, circulated around children characters. Akin to The Dark Crystal or Labyrinth. You know, there was an early 90s film called The Gate that was a horror movie with children as the main roles. The Never-Ending Story, you know, things along those lines. Even classic sort of Disney films like Peter Pan and Pinocchio, where you have these children off on adventures or misadventures and they're experiencing the awe and wonder, but there's also that other leg that drops where things get very palpable and scary. And I most notably want to also reference an 80s movie, Return to Oz, which was a somewhat pseudo-sequel, not direct sequel by you know, stretch of the imagination, for The Wizard of Oz, where you're revisiting Dorothy Gale so many months later after her initial apparent visit to Oz, and as the title suggests, she goes back and all hell is broken loose, you know, that kind of thing. And I really feel like if any other show out there could do this kind of thing in the kind of way I'm talking about and do it well, it would definitely be Doctor Who. I know in this PC age you would have people possibly, you know, raising up their arms and becoming outspoken against working children to death over the length of an entire series and that kind of thing. And we don't necessarily need it to be an entire series. I'd love to see maybe a 2-parter, 3-parter, something like that along these lines. But it's a matter of really recapturing that sensation of being a kid and the awe and wonder. Now, we do see in Doctor Who a lot of the adult companions, they're all adults really, for the most part, you know, they do experience the wonders of the universe. And it's one of those things where I just feel like the childlike aspect, the grandfatherly Doctor aspect, hearkening back to William Hartnell's first Doctor and his comic book counterpart, there's something magical about that to me. And I felt that in the case of, you know, Cyril and Lily Arwell, respectively, as portrayed by Maurice Cole and Holly Earl, their performances were just immediately endearing to me and memorable, which is something I can't necessarily say for some of the other brother-sister duos. It's something they are revisiting anyway in the modern series. You think of Victorian Clara in The Snowman, I believe it was, and she's, you know, the ward of these two children, and the modern Clara, when we first meet her, she is also taking care, sort of being a nanny to these two children. And they kind of sort of did what I'm talking about in the Neil Gaiman Cybermen episode, where those kids, you know, orchestrated their way to go on an adventure with the 11th Doctor and Clara, respectively, to this, you know, wondrous sort of space-faring fairground, if you will, rides and all. And there's something that I feel was a missed opportunity along that line where, you know, I wasn't really attracted to these characters, these child characters. They were kind of off-putting to me. Whereas if you took the Victorian children, or you took Cyril and Lily Arwell, there was something very endearing. There was something very much attractive in the performances, and you really believed them. And I liked that it was shifted up. That, you know, you basically had the Doctor spending most of his time with Lily, and they were chasing after Cyril, who is lost in this winter wonderland sort of backdrop. You know, they just lost their father, and their mother, Madge Arwell, was trying to keep that hidden from them to give them as good a Christmas as she possibly could, and then she would let them know after the fact. And she was seeking help, and the Doctor got her message and got involved, and kind of sort of, you know, they were going to a country vacation house or something like that. And he arrives before them, and kind of like a series of unfortunate events, the book, you know, he's furbishing the house for all these sort of kid-friendly things, like, you have the water tap, but then there's one that's lemonade, and all these magical qualities that really spoke to me and really just made me call back to these movies of my youth and the vibes and all that kind of stuff. And so they're very much on the chase to find Cyril, because there was this big Christmas package sitting in sort of the living room area of this big house, and he is very curious about it, and it turns out to be a portal to this planet, and all of that stuff with like the living wooden creatures and all the trees having, for all intents and purposes, souls, reaching out and screaming out, seeking a vessel through which to dispatch from this world that was going to be like just, incinerated. There was something really magical about that, but it was also terrifying and reminded me of those scares in my youth, seeing the sort of Gnome King or whatever he was called in Return to Oz. Those visuals would give me nightmares, and seeing these giant wooden, people. You had what looked essentially like a king and a queen of wood, made of wood. And the slow, methodical sort of chasing of this king of wood, if you will, after the children and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I was hearkening back to being a kid and putting myself into the position of what a kid might be experiencing now, watching that when it first aired. And I got goosebumps. I was like, man, this is going to really spark the imaginations of so many kids who see this and turn them into fans of sci-fi and horror and all these kinds of things that Doctor Who has always well fitted into itself. I mean, it can reform itself and become something different in its every incarnation from episode to episode. And so it was really very much that idea of that episode and these two performances. I felt they were really well directed. You saw a lot of emotion out of Holly Earle's portrayal as Lily Arwell, the elder sister of Cyril, as I say, portrayed by Maurice Cole. And like with the Cyril character, there wasn't really even much you had to direct for him. It was just sort of, he's on this ice world looking at these trees and all these things, and he's just kind of, like, that's all that's really required of him, just to look at things, in awe. But it was well directed, and they were endearing characters. And I really felt like they would have been able to pitch perfectly embody exactly the vibe I'm talking about, because you had it in that episode. And speaking more about sort of the, overarching idea of children with the Doctor, again, to call back on John and Gillian, the first Doctor's comic book companions and air quotes grandchildren. These are fascinating times to look back upon, because I know a lot of people who are Doctor Who fans who grew up with it, like literally all their lives, even people much older than me, who were there for those first run comics and everything, subsequently would later reconfigure what John and Gillian were in the mythos of Doctor Who, because they weren't necessarily happy with the fact that when these characters were first in existence, it was very much troubles with licensing that the comic producers and printers and writers did not want to have to pay extra. They're already paying for the Doctor and the TARDIS. They don't want to have to pay for Susan, Ian, Barbara, the first run companions of the series. And it's understandable, but I mean, look at how much was lost. They couldn't use the Daleks. They couldn't use these, three companions people were seeing every week on TV. But there's something still magical about that to me. I've subsequently read that some of these Doctor Who fans who grew up with it would later become writers and try to reconfigure who they were in the mythos of Doctor Who, because they just couldn't stand it. Like they were trying to explain it out. It's kind of like the argument of, is Skaro here? Is it destroyed? Was it back? Is it a new Skaro? Like that whole incontinuity thing. And in one particular story, I thought it was fascinating that I think it's the Seventh Doctor. I read this on Wiki, where he is back in the land of fiction, calling back to that backdrop, going back to the Second Doctor, Patrick Troughton, with the Mind Robber, and it's a product of the land of fiction where he runs into a John and Gillian who are trying to convince him, according to the write-up I read, that they are his grandchildren, and that his name is actually Dr. Dr. Who, that's his name. I mean, like calling back to the Peter Cushing films, which also in sort of, if I can just a brief aside, also kind of has that a little bit. I mean, you did have two more adult-oriented companions to, the Doctor Who, this old earthly Doctor Who, scientist, whatever you want to call him, but you also had a very childlike Susan, which is kind of what I'm talking about as well. But, the idea that the Seventh Doctor wasn't having it in this particular story. He's like, no, I'm not, Doctor Who. That's not my name and all that kind of stuff. It just really speaks to the idea that certain people were not that warmed to the John and Gillian being the grandchildren of the Doctor thing. It like doesn't make sense to them. It's kind of a similar issue I had bringing up the Peter Cushing films again with those films as compared to Doctor Who proper. I much prefer the Ian, Barbara, and Susan in the series, and there were times where I would try to sit through those Peter Cushing films and I just can't stand the way they portray Ian. I can't stand the differences. He's not a Time Lord. He's not from Gallifrey. Even though they didn't know that back then, they made him a human mad scientist, and it's just like it rubbed me the wrong way. And subsequently, it took somebody pointing out that they actually conceived of the Peter Cushing movies being the sort of fairy tale story as written by Ian and Barbara proper when they returned to Earth to, basically inspire kids with this mystical, magical awe and wonder-befilled adventure, that they were on and that kind of thing. And then I began to be more accepting of that. Again, I digress. But, there was also a story I read in the wiki about John and Gillian where the Eighth Doctor, we sort of, get to see a portal into his mentality in his off time when he's having his, sort of brief naps and everything, because depending on who you go to, he either does or doesn't sleep and everything. And it's something where John and Gillian exist in his psyche. It's almost like the Mind Palace, to take from Sherlock, the series Sherlock, where he goes on these much more sort of fluffy, less dangerous, less life and death adventures in his Mind Palace with these two, pseudo-grandchildren, John and Gillian, and this is his off time. This is what keeps him mentally balanced and like critical in his mind at all other times. And that to me was really fascinating. And I could even see it done in that sort of fashion where we, visit in the series proper a real John and Gillian, like bring them into the series and do a two-parter where, it doesn't make sense to the Doctor. Whoever the companion is of the day, eschew them for a little while, and maybe they make appearances like being the voice box, trying to reach the Doctor. But throughout the course of the two-parter, he has these two children who he's taking on adventures, who are, for all intents and purposes, meant to be his grandchildren. And I think that would be a fascinating character study into the mind of the Doctor if it's something he has created and it's like out of his subconscious. He doesn't even realize through the course of it. It's a mystery to him to figure out, to unravel, where did this come from? Who is doing this to me? And then he finds it's, he brought it on himself because he needs to catch a break. He needs to take a break. And so his subconscious is, sort of rallying against his mental state. And we visit this world where this is true, where these children are on adventures. And we get snippets of, sort of mini glimpses of multiple adventures to really signify the passage of time, where you get, the scares, and then you get little glimpses of the awe and wonder and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it doesn't need to be stretched out for an entire series, is basically what I'm saying. But there's there's a romanticism there that I call back to my childhood, and I call back to, especially in parallel to what I've heard many times over from people who grew up all their lives with Doctor Who. It's something that came to me in the last 10 years, a little over 10 years now, but I had remembered vague memories of encountering the series as a child. My mother would watch it on the, U.S. channel PBS in rerun format with Tom Baker. A lot during the Gothic horror period. You think of the Key to Time stories. And most specifically, my first memory of Doctor Who that ever occurred to me was from the Stones of Blood in that particular series, that I apparently was probably sitting on the couch beside my mother watching. And it was one of those early impressions of exactly what I'm talking about, and I've heard so many people talking about, in their excitement for Doctor Who and how it affected them, and how it left lasting impressions in both the performances of the Doctor of the day, but also the scares, the monsters, and all that kind of stuff. And I know in this modern sense, I mean, there would probably be people picketing and trying to get this to not work out, trying to make this not happen. What are you doing to these kids? What are you putting them through, and everything like that? But there is something lost to the idea of watering everything down and making everything, you know, primrose and rainbows and all this kind of stuff. I mean, life is harsh. There is a cold, hard reality that a lot of these things, in their creativity, in their imagination, speak to you, especially as you are youth, and leave that lasting impression of, well, things don't always work out. Sometimes life is hard. Sometimes it is dark. But the contrast to that is seeing the Doctor and his companions, childlike or not, you know, overcoming those obstacles and knowing that you have to be the taskmaster. You have to keep at it. And these are lessons that I feel are all too important, that a lot of people may be missing out of. I think Doctor Who is the closest to the modern embodiment, how it is now, in really recapturing those essences. And I feel like it would be that much more so to be able to, you know, see a story play out, as I say, with a Cyril and Lily Arwell, or a John and Gillian, where it's really speaking to the youth that are watching the program today, and implanting in them this sense of creativity, this sense of, you know, fear, this sense of being careful and being on your guard, and all these different kinds of things that I took out of them, seeing the films of my youth, as I, you know, listed off before, and everything like that. And I just think it would be a really enrapturing opportunity to inject that into a modern Doctor Who scenario, especially with Peter Capaldi, who is the current Doctor as of the time of this recording. He is grandfatherly. He has that natural sort of joie de vivre, you know, that natural, just, I mean, I've seen videos of him in character at events, and he's talking to kids, and in one particular instance, he brought up his granddaughter, Susan, in answer to, you know, are there any companions of old you'd want to revisit, or is there anyone from your past you wish you could see again? And it just made me misty-eyed and giddy. It gave me goosebumps, because that's what I mean. That's what I'm talking about. You know, that whole dynamic. I loved the Doctor and Susan, his granddaughter. I loved that whole framework. Just accolades unending for William Hartnell and Carol Ann Ford's portrayals. Even though I do, you know, I did a whole video in this series talking about the Susan that might have been, even though she was kind of cut short from what they had told her would be her role as that character. But I think, you know, there's no time like the present. Why can't we do it now? And so I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below, my fellow Whovians, if you think I'm talking sense with any of this stuff, if you think there's, you know, no end-all, be-all for this to ever need to happen in the history of Doctor Who, bringing kids in. I'm somebody who, I really take or leave children characters, children actors in things. They can really rub me the wrong way and ruin the experience entirely. But I feel like more often than not, as I say, Doctor Who, the series, have really been able to well capture just great performances, even from child actors, more often than not, as I say. Not in every case, but, you know. So yeah, as I say, I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts on this particular twosome in the history of Doctor Who, revisiting them and seeing them on further adventures, or, as I say, branching out to a John and Gillian kind of dream world framework. Do you think it would be riveting? Do you think it would be interesting? Would it be something you'd want to see? Take it or leave it, love it or hate it, anything goes in the comments below. Just love having the conversation, and if it's not your bag, let me know. So, otherwise, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.